Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me. In this video, I'm going to create a handmade die cut card, and I'm going to be using this Sizzix Fireside die set. Now, this is a die set that I've had for a very long time and haven't had a chance to use it yet, so I thought now is a good time. There are some Christmas decorations with this die set, but I thought I'd keep them off, and I thought it'd be cool just as a kind of winter, baby it's cold outside type card. So I have my pieces already die cut. I am taking the brown that I die cut for the fireplace, and I'm using some distress ink in Walnut Stain in order to ink it. And then I have the stone pieces for the fireplace, and I die cut them in a gray. I'm using some Hickory Smoke distress ink to ink that. This inking is just going to give it a little bit of extra dimension, and there are some areas of these die cuts that are embossed, and by inking them lightly with an ink blending brush, it just brings that out a little bit more. For the center of the fireplace, there's not a piece in the die cut for it, so I just have a piece of black cardstock, and I'm using some Fossilized Amber Distress Oxide ink, just lightly blending it on that cardstock to put in the center of that fireplace. It'll kind of put a warm glow behind the fire die cut that we have. I'm just using my scissors to quickly cut that out. It doesn't need to be pretty, it's just going to be glued behind the die cut, and no one is ever going to see how it was cut. I do want to position it though so that I see a little bit of the dark around the outside, and once again can cut off any pieces that I don't see. So I'm using some Barely Art glue. I have it in a bottle here that has a really fine tip to it. This way I can be nice and precise with my die cuts and get as much or as little glue as I want. And it's really handy to use it this way. It's easy to get a lot of glue if you want a lot, but for very intricate die cuts, it's nice to be able to just put a tiny bit and dot it. This glue starts to grab that paper really quite quickly and hold them together. I do like to put acrylic blocks on my pieces while I'm waiting for them to dry and while I'm putting glue on other pieces, just to kind of hold everything flat. There's one die in this die cut set that has all these tiny intricate pieces, and I've die cut them in a darker brown, and they're just to add trim and edges to this fireplace die cut. So this glue with the fine tip is really going to help a lot with these die cuts. I left the majority of them in the die. The only ones that are out are ones that came out while I was die cutting. That way I can take them out one at a time and glue them down. I'm not going to miss anything this way, and I'm not going to have a pile of die cuts and try to figure out exactly where each and every one of them go. Don't need to ink these ones at all. Just because they're so tiny, you wouldn't notice any difference. So I'm just going to glue them down there. And I did do them in a darker brown so that they're a little bit more of a feature detail of this die cut. Now, this would be absolutely adorable as a holiday card. It would even be adorable as a larger holiday card with also a Santa as well as the stockings on the fireplace. I think it would be really cool to do as a piece or to decorate a scrapbook layout as well. I love die cuts like these that have lots of little bits that give extra detail and dimension when you put them together. They're usually pretty easy to figure out. This one here, there's a couple pieces these tiny pieces on the side that I wasn't sure exactly which one was supposed to go where, but it also doesn't really matter if you happen to swap a couple back and forth. You don't notice it. It's just detail on that die cut. And I love die cuts that have a lot of detail to them that give a lot of visual texture as well. Now, I die cut all these pieces off screen just to make it a little bit quicker for assembling the card. If you've never done die cutting before, I have lots of videos on here where I do die cut for the cards that I'm creating. I will often use either my Spellbinders Platinum 6, and I also have a Sizzix machine that I use as well. Now, I said before that I'm using some Barely Art glue for gluing this together. When assembling a die cut like this that has a lot of different little pieces, I definitely prefer to use liquid glue for them. That way you can move and shimmy things in place and get them placed perfectly before that adhesive starts to take hold. If you were to use double-sided tape, you have to put it down pretty precisely the very first time you put it down. And this takes a little bit of the worry about getting it precisely placed because you can shimmy it in place with that glue. I'm using reverse tweezers to hold my die cuts, and these are ones that when you're not holding it, it holds on to whatever is in there. You actually squeeze it in order to open up. So for something like this, it makes it a lot easier to be able to squeeze the tweezers just to open it up. I have some tonic Inca Gold cardstock here that I die cut my flames out of and missed filming that part. I did die cut 2 of them and glued them down in place, but I'm putting some glossy accents just on the front one. So the Inca Gold cardstock here is a gold cardstock, but it has a bit of a holographic shine to it. And I thought that was going to be perfect for these flames because it just gives them, it almost makes it look like they're dancing, gives them a little bit of a different shine, and it looks a little bit more like a real fire, just a little bit. I have the grates to go in front of the fireplace here, and I did die cut 2 of them, one out of black and one out of a matte silver, like a dark matte silver cardstock, and I'm gluing them on top of each other. The silver is what's going to be showing, but I wanted to have that, give that a little bit more dimension. And by die cutting something a couple times and gluing them on top of each other, it makes it really easy to die cut those pieces as well as get that extra dimension. Once I have all of those pieces in place, I'll put my acrylic block on there, set that aside to completely dry. Now I could glue this fireplace onto a plain background, but I thought a textured background would be really interesting. So I have this 3D brick embossing folder, and I used some gray cardstock. I misted both sides before putting it in my folder and putting it through the machine. This is just going to soften the paper fibers and help it go through a little bit. I also have this wood grain one that I thought might look kind of cool as the background as well. I chose not to use it because doing brown for the wood grain plus brown for the fireplace, I thought it was going to be a lot more brown. And by using this brick here, it just offered a few more opportunities for adding a little bit of extra color behind that fireplace and helping that to really stand out on the front of a card. And that's always something that you want to consider when you're adding backgrounds to your die cut cards. You want to make sure that you're enhancing rather than having everything all blend together. So once that moisture from misting that cardstock was completely dry, I took the same Hickory Smoke distress pad that I had used to ink the fireplace, as well as the same Walnut Stain one, and inked that a little bit. And then I'm also using some fired brick. I figured the name was perfect for coloring brick, as well as the fact that I wanted to add some red to it. I'm using the edge of the pad as well as the side, and I'll go in every once in a while with the corner of my pad if there's an area that it's just not reaching that I want some extra color on. This is a really deeply etched 3D embossing folder, so there's so much dimension here, and I'm trying to keep the mortar part of the embossing as gray as possible. But I do want some color on the front of that brick, but there's still a lot of dimension on those bricks. So I will go in, or I am going in right now, with an ink blending tool and just getting more red on there. I'm also going to take my distress sprayer that I used to spray that cardstock before putting in it in the embossing folder, and I misted it just to help that ink weep and flow out a little bit. I let that dry, and then I also wanted to give a little bit of extra texture to that brick. I have some frosted crystal embossing powder, and I'm using that. I took the Versamark pad, just rubbed it on the front, and then stuck my powder to it. And that's going to be enough to hold it on there while it dries. I didn't want to use regular embossing powder because I didn't want it to have a really shiny look to it, so this frosted crystal is perfect. The frosted crystal will have just a slight sheen to it, but it's going to be more grainy and granular like frost is, and will be perfect for the brick texture for this background. And it's just another way to add a different texture to the front of this card. I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder, and you can really easily see exactly where the powder has melted and where it hasn't. I only needed to do the top and the 2 sides of this card because I'm going to put my fireplace in there. So that center part, I really didn't need to actually put the embossing powder on top of it. So that's why there's not really anything there. Once that background is done, I am taking my trimmer and I'm cutting it down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. This paper was, I think, 4 inches by 5 1/4 to start, but when you go and do the 3D embossing, it changes the size of the paper, it warps it a little bit, and it's often not very square. So it's a good idea before gluing it onto the front of your card to go to a trimmer, make sure to square it up and make sure that everything will line up nicely. And also because there are 3D embossing folders, there's a lot of dimension, and I want to make sure when I glue this down to glue the lower areas that are going to be touching the paper below. This goes with any 3D embossing folder. You want to make sure that that glue can actually reach that background so it glues it properly. I'll put an acrylic block on there to hold it down and hold it nice and flat and set that aside to dry. Now, because the center of that mantle for that fireplace die cut is not having those Christmas decorations and the stockings, I decided that that was where I'm going to put my sentiment. So I have a sentiment here that says, "Baby, it's cold outside." I was looking for something that said warm wishes or something like that, or warm winter wishes, and couldn't find it. And I thought this one would work as well with that fireplace die cut. I just stamped it with the Hickory Smoke ink that I had used to ink part of the fireplace. It looked better with the gray rather than the brown. And then I took my tiny trimmer and trimmed that down. I'm also using that same gray color to mat it. This way I'm going to have a frame around it. It's going to make that sentiment just a little bit bigger. And because that stamping as well as that mat is gray over top of the brown fireplace, it's just going to pop out a little bit more. After I have everything die cut or cut down and perfectly matted, I'm going to use some foam tape strips and use that on the back of my sentiment just to have that pop off a little bit more. It could easily be glued flat, but I just liked the thought of the dimension on there popping out from the rest of the die cuts that are on there. And I just have some thin foam strips that I'm using. You could also use round or square foam pop dots. That will work as well. It's now time to glue down that fireplace die cut, and you can glue it wherever you want on the front of the card. I chose to do a vertical card here, but you could easily do a horizontal one. The only thing with doing a horizontal one is then you need to change the way you emboss the bricks, and that embossing folder is not quite wide enough to do the 5.5 inches. So here is the finished card, just something a little bit different for a winter card. Sometimes it's nice to do something like a fireplace rather than snow, although I do absolutely love doing wintry, snowy cards, but I also wanted to get some use out of this die cut. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time here, and I hope you have a fantastic day.